there is an intro to biking in the colder weather. Biking is a classic summer activity. However, just as there are benefits to every one of the 4 seasons, you can keep on enjoying biking year-round with a little preparation. So as we go into general preparation, let's start as to why we bike in the cold. Caro, why do you bike in the cold?
Yeah, so just like in the summertime and warmer months, we have this acronym for reasons as to why we're going to bike. So it still applies in the wintertime. So the acronym is FEET. So each letter stands for reason for why we're going to bike. So even in the wintertime, biking is still fun. It's a great form of exercise. It is great for the environment. And it's a cheap, fast, and easy form of transportation. And also in the wintertime, a lot of people actually are less active as the temperature drops. So biking is a great way to keep active and keep you moving while also being able to be outside enjoying the sunshine and avoiding all the germs that come with maybe traveling through public transportation like the bus or the train. And it also keeps you warmer since you're moving, your heart is pumping, and you are not just standing outside in the cold waiting for the bus or the train. And also, we still bike because it's possible, and it can actually be really pleasurable as long as you do the right prep and it's done smartly.
Perfect.
So that's why we're gonna keep biking in the colder weather. But I don't know, can you tell us a little bit about how you get ready to do like your route prep and everything?
Yeah, so generally for route prep, we would just want to make sure that we have an idea as to where we're going when we are prepping our route. Our route is a big part of making sure that we get to one place to another, possibly and safely. So route prep, we want to make sure we gradually go. If you're extending your riding season for the first time, it's a great idea to kind of ease into it. Take shorter, less time-sensitive trips as you kind of build up your confidence as well as your capabilities. We also want to mention just using routes you're familiar with and notice how the environment changes with the weather as well. I know when you generally think of the word weather or winter, it makes us think of snow, but realistically, there aren't actually as many heavy snow days as you would initially think. The roads are typically cleared off and dry throughout the day or the general cold months due to the city crews who do clear the streets. However, if you do need to walk somewhere, you are depending on the shoveling habits of your neighbors. Much of the time, you'll be able to take your usual route. When it does snow, you can experience the joy and, just the general adventure of kind of like riding. But when the flakes kind of pile up onto your feet, then you might need to kind of alter your route. And that's when, kind of looking at a bike map would generally help you with that. If you live in a one-way street, you probably already know that during the biggest snow days, they're often not plowed right away. So if your route relies on one-ways, you'll probably need a plan B. But the good news is if you do live around or are around multi-road lanes, they are usually and typically plowed first, so that's a plus. Also, if there's a bike lane or if you are comfortable around motor vehicles and taking that lane, that also might be your best choice as well. Remember, you can always also put your bike on the CTA as well, like the bus or the train, to kind of shorten that commute that you have. But I do want to mention and declare that there are going to be rush hour hours that you cannot take your bike on the train. Those rush hour times are going to be 7 to 9 a.m. and 4 to 6 p.m. So those are going to be the general times that you cannot bring your bike on the train. Biking partway and taking public transportation are a great form for kind of conserving your rest and getting to where you need to go more safely. Now that we kind of have an idea about our route prep, how can we kind of make sure our bike is ready to go, Caro?
Yeah, so there's a lot of stuff you could get for your bike or just make it yourself, but you don't always have to. But here's some things that a lot of winter riders do recommend that you get for winter riding. So I got a few things here on my bike. So the first thing you kind of want to think about is maybe getting some fenders to cover your tires. That way, if there's snow or water on the ground, it's not coming up at you. And you can buy these from the store, or you can make them yourself out of, say, plastic water bottles or cardboard or even like inner tube. You can just do it yourself.
That's awesome.
Something else you might want to consider getting are pogies, or a lot of people know them as bar mitts or bar mittens. They really just create this little pocket for your hands to keep them warm. So you have your brake levers, your gear shifters, and just your handlebars and your grip. So they keep you nice and warm. So it's an extra layer of protection for your hands while you're riding. So you can also make sure you have some lights. So I've got my white headlight in the front and my red rear light in the back. You might want to have those even in the wintertime during the day, just because it's a little darker, the sun sets earlier, so you just want to be able to stay visible at all times. So lights can really help out with that. You might also want to have an insulated water bottle if you want to take a warm beverage with you. When it's cold out, it might be nice to be able to sip on something warm as you're riding. There's that. You also want to have some heavy-duty chain lube, like this one here, just so that you're making sure your chain is lubed up and ready to go at all times. You also might want to have a seat cover for your seat in case you do have a higher end saddle. You want to make sure that that's protected from all types of weather. If you wanted to, you could also consider getting some snow tires for your bikes, or studded tires. But if you didn't want to buy those and have to like switch out the tires, you could also consider inflating your regular tires to a slightly lower PSI than you normally would, just so that they're covering more ground and it's getting better traction as you're riding. Something else to consider is weatherproof bag or backpack. That way, if it starts to snow or rain as you're riding, you can make sure that all your stuff is protected.
That sounds great. I mean, there's so many general options that you can just kind of like add onto your bike as general accessories. And although you don't need all of them, they're a great alternative and a great option for you to have as a better means to ride during the wintertime and just to keep you generally safe.
Yeah, so now that we have our bikes ready to go, just for general colder weather biking, we also want to think about what we want to wear. So what are some things that you would typically take on a colder weather ride?
Yeah, so I'm glad you asked, Caro. So initially we're gonna have our top 3 things that we wanna prioritize in keeping warm, which is gonna be our hands, our feet, and our face. Those are gonna be the things that get the coldest fastest. You should definitely start to build your warmth from the skin level on out. So we're gonna start with the general kind of materials that we would want to, wear, and that's gonna be just general merino wool or, synthetic. So I'll start with just like a general base layer, and then in terms of our layers, we're gonna have 3. Our 3 is going to be like a base layer. This is going to be a good base layer in terms of what to wear. These are cycling pants that would definitely help retain that heat. One thing I do kind of want to point out is cotton is going to be essentially a no-go, only because although it is cozy and it makes nice for soft nightly wear, when it gets wet, it gets cold and it retains moisture, which is not something we want when we're cycling. So you can definitely be kind of uncomfortable and possibly put yourself at risk for hypothermia. As we have and pass our base layer, we're gonna have that kind of general second layer. With layering, the idea is to make sure that you're covered as much as possible, so no exposed skin. That exposed skin is vulnerable to becoming cold, and that will change how your temperature in your body is. So again, we mentioned the base layer. The next thing we want to make sure is not just having our top, but also a bottom as well. I showed you the bottom base layer, but again, we also want to have something like a top base layer. This could generally be something kind of like a top that's thinner. As we move on from our base layer, we're going to have that second layer, which is going to be, again, kind of just wool or fleece are nice options. After we have just our base layer and that second layer, we want to make sure our third layer is the most protective. That's going to be like a windproof jacket or pants, or a water repellent jacket and pants as well. We're going to layer those on top. Water repellent pants are also helpful, and you can also go with rain pants or a rain skirt as well. Always an option. So some general footwear that we might want to wear when we're cycling in the cool or colder weather. We want to make sure that footwear in itself is comfortable, warm, and generally water resistant or waterproof. And we also want to make sure that it works with our pedals, because that's going to be the prime thing. After we kind of have our footwear, we also want to make sure that our skin under our foot is kind of warm, right? So we're going to move on to socks. So socks are generally, we don't kind of want to pile on too many pairs. You want to make sure you get that one good thick pair of warming socks. And I would generally recommend wool or any synthetic fabric that will help to insulate that. Beautiful. So in terms of shoes and boots, we want to make sure that your shoe in itself is not too heavy, like an actual winter boot, because it may interfere with you cycling. We want to make sure you kind of look for something that's waterproof or water repellent that has a low profile. That'll definitely help you getting into the groove of cycling. There are going to be shoe covers that you can purchase, or you can also kind of just go on the internet or do it yourself with a plastic bag and putting it over your sock or your shoe in itself to make sure that you are all warm and good to go. We want to make sure that our head and neck are also covered as well. So in terms of our head and neck covering, we want to make sure that you have that, and that's going to include your ears and just your general face. But we want to make sure that you can still breathe as well and kind of maneuver comfortably. That's what we want. We also have a cap as well. A cap, so right here I have a cap that's going to be with ear covers as well. It'll keep you warm. This is going to be a mixture of some fleece as well with another general material out on top. This is great considering it'll keep you warm in the wintertime on your rides, but it'll also kind of be minimal in terms of how much room it'll add to your helmet after you put your helmet on, considering, you know, it does take up that extra room. So I would say when purchasing winter gear, especially for like your head and your hands, I would take that into account. Beautiful. So now that we have that, you also want to make sure that you can take off the padding that's attached to your foam on your helmet if your cap does not fit the way you'd like. The next thing we kind of want to move on to is like a face mask or like a neck gaiter, kind of something like a baklava or like something for general cold conditions that would cover the general head area. That's ideal, and that's what we want. We want to help keep and insulate that heat, that our body heat. All right, and then from then on, we just want to make sure that we have either like a helmet visor or a baseball cap. That's going to keep the snow from getting inside your helmet and keeping your head kind of, you know, dry, and that's what we want. We don't want anything wet, especially when it's cold. Again, that hypothermia is no joke. Beautiful. So now, again, we'll go with our head coverings. Our hand coverings are going to be next. For hand coverings, we're going to have either mittens, gloves, liners. Here, we actually have a few. So these are going to be insulated gloves. Then we also have heated gloves that, as you can see, when I press this button, it turns on. So if you would like to keep warm during the winter weathers, these are great investments, especially if you ride or cycling is your main form of transportation. Beautiful. And then if you don't want to invest in that, again, we can have just some simple single layer gloves as well, always optional. Beautiful. So now we want to make sure, again, our hands are warm, our hands are protected. That's what these are for, to stay moisturized as well. I think that's a big thing. The next thing from our hands, something sensitive, is going to be our eyes. So we can mention about how we can protect our eyes with, you know, goggles. Here we have a pair of goggles. It's going to help to keep the snow and rain out of your eyes. And especially if you have sensitive eyes, I would definitely highly recommend something of this sort. And then general extra tips. So again, keeping your neck and wrist covered to help maintain your core temperature are going to be a big thing that I would highly recommend to make sure you keep attention to. Arm warmers and extra long sleeves can be helpful to keep heat in at the wrist as well. Again, a helmet cover, again, you can either go out to purchase one or you can use a shower cap as an alternative, a cheap DIY alternative to help from rain and snow coming from into the vents of your helmet, especially if you do have kind of holes to help ventilate in your helmet. I think that would definitely be ideal. And then also we have, you know, just single-use heat packs that can fit into mittens. So here, one of the insulated gloves, they also have a small compartment that you can actually fit warmers in here to make sure that your hands and your fingertips stay warm. So that'd be ideal as well. We also want to make sure that none of your clothing is loose or will fall off and will kind of just interfere with your biking abilities. That's something we want to take into account. And again, the idea is you should feel a little cool when starting your ride, but ideally it's the idea that you will warm up as you pedal. Once you gain that momentum, your core temperature will slowly rise. And again, if you have layered too much, you'll kind of become too sweaty, and that'll kind of interfere just generally with having you to stop and kind of remove those layers, which is why we're kind of guiding you onto making sure that you layer correctly. So now we have our bike ready to go, our footwear, our general wear. On the road, what is something that we should definitely pay attention to and just kind of take into account, Caro?
Yeah, so biking in the colder weather and in the winter months is similar to riding in the warmer weather, but there are a few differences that you kind of want to pay attention to as you're riding. So in the colder months, the sun is obviously going to set sooner. So like I mentioned before, we want to make sure we have our front and rear lights on, especially in the daytime, just because sun sets earlier, it's going to get darker sooner, and you just want to be visible even during the day. Okay. So let's talk about, let's say, rainy days. So when the weather is not the best, so it's raining right now. Some things to think about are your brakes. Ideally, disc brakes are a little bit better than, say, rim brakes, because rim brakes can be affected by the water that's like on the road a lot more than the disc brakes. So those would be a little bit better to have. And also just thinking about braking in general, if the road is slick, you definitely don't want to be braking too hard or too much. So just adjusting your riding to account for that is something you should consider. There's also a lot of slippery spots, like painted road markings, say like a crosswalk. So you don't want to brake too hard on those. Also things like steel plates, manhole covers, and train tracks and say leaves, those can be really slick. So you don't want to brake too hard on those because you might slide a little too much. And also you can ride on ice if you wanted to or needed to. The only thing is you want to make sure that you are relaxing your hands on the grips. You are not braking suddenly, and you're just kind of coasting over it. But if there's a lot of ice, like miles of ice, you ideally want to avoid it if you don't have the appropriate tires, or if you do have the studded tires, you could go over the ice a little bit more safely. But say when it's snowing, some things to consider are your turning. You definitely want to turn slowly and upright. You want to avoid leaning over on your bike because you might slide and fall, so you don't want to do that. Also, again, with the braking, you do want to brake gently, and you want to primarily use your rear wheel when you're braking. So that'll be with your right hand if you've got both brakes right there. That'll slow down the back wheel. You will want to avoid braking too hard on the front wheel because it can cause your bike to slide, and you're more likely to fall off if that happens. Okay. So we want to avoid doing that. So another thing to consider is that you can ride in a lower gear to reduce how hard you're pedaling. It'll make it an easier, smoother ride for you. And you can also think about lowering your seat just a little bit to make it easier to put your foot down on the ground when it is a little slippery, so you're not leaning on your bike too much if you have to. And also, if you are carrying bags or something, you want to consider evening out the weight of your cargo just to promote that balance as you're riding so you're not sliding around. But yeah, so that's some stuff for on the road. What about when you get to your destination? What are some things that you might want to think about in the colder weather? Yeah, I'm glad you asked, Caro. So I would say some of the things you should mention or you should kind of take into account at your destination is bringing your bike inside when you get the chance to allow for the general defrosting of it, considering you were cycling in like a cooler, colder weather. And that's not typically what people do, usually 12 months out the year. So defrosting and drying, not only of your bike, but yourself as well, I think is a good idea. Depending on the flooring where you can bring your bike, I would say kind of lay down a floor mat or a rug to kind of collect all that debris and all that icing that kind of just comes off and runs off the bike, considering it was in the cold. I also would want to mention, as we mentioned earlier, in terms of our layering, considering you're inside now, I would like to mention how you should probably
de-layer, so taking your layers off and throwing on something like a fresh t-shirt and something that's light to kind of gather, give your body the idea that you're kind of not in motion anymore, and it could kind of regulate your body temperature, and that's initially what we want. If your layers are damp, we want to make sure that you kind of try to find a discreet place to allow for them to air dry if you are kind of out and about in a setting that you aren't typically in usually. But if you cycle through extreme conditions or lots of salt, I would say take some time to clean off your bike and drive chain and just kind of generally re-lube everything that's needed. Considering the conditions do kind of eat away at the bike in itself. So perfect. So now that we have all of our ideas gathered for a great winter ride, I wanted to thank everybody, and I hope to see more people out there riding in the wintertime. And thanks so much to you, Caro, as well, just for giving out the great information about what we can do to be better cyclists in the wintertime.
Yeah, thank you as well for all the information you provided as well. So Safe to Be, we'll be right back.
Yeah.